English step by step, past simple, step 1. Remember, if you like this kind of video, click like. If you want more videos like this, click subscribe. And if you want to request a video, please request a lesson in the comments. So let's look at past simple. When do we use past simple? We use past simple when we tell a story, when we write a report, when we describe any kind of finished event, when we talk about an experience, or when we talk about historical events. In other words, we use past simple for events in the past. Let's look at some examples. Number 1. I woke up, got out of bed, had a shower, ate breakfast, and started my day. Number 2. Negative example. He didn't get up early on Sunday, but slept until 11. Here's an example talking about history. Henry VIII had 7 wives. He divorced the first one and executed the second. And here, number 4 is an example with a question. Did many people attend the meeting? Now, the first thing we have to think about when we're learning the past simple is the pronunciation, because there are some tricky things to remember. The form of the past tense is actually quite easy to learn, and you can learn it quite quickly. But the problem is the pronunciation of this basic form. So let's look at the form and pronunciation together. For many past tense forms, you just add ed to the infinitive, that's the main form of the verb. However, it's important to know the pronunciation. Let's look at these examples. Start, started. Now that's quite easy because it's just tud at the end there. Now this one here, live, lived. Now sometimes students make a mistake and they say lived, like started, instead of lived. So we'll look at more examples like that where you don't pronounce the E. Lived. The next one is worked. And again, many people learning English, they make the mistake. They say worked, like started. But don't be fooled by the spelling. Think more about the end of the word. Worked. So work changes to worked. Next one, invite, invited. Now that's the same as start, started. Invite, invited. Next one, love, loved. So remember, it's different from invited because you don't say loved, you say loved. And that's like lived, loved. Next one, watched, watched. And again, that's different from invited. You don't say watched, it's like worked, worked, watched. So you can see there's many ways that you can make mistakes when you're pronouncing these past tense verbs, the regular past tense verbs. So we're going to look at regular past tense verbs first. So let's think about all these pronunciation problems. So the form and the pronunciation. Now, I advise you to use 3 steps when you're thinking about, when you're making a decision about how to pronounce the past tense form, the regular past tense form with ed. So, first, step 1, look at the infinitive of the verb. Now, the infinitive is the main form in the dictionary. For example, here on the left, and in all of this video lesson, the infinitives will be on the left. Start, invite, hate, live, smile, turn, work, stop, wash. These are all infinitives. So, first you look at the infinitive of the verb, and then you look at the final sound of the infinitive. Well, for example here, start. the final sound is t. Invite, the final sound is t. Hate, again, t. Now here the final sound live is v. Here the final sound is l. Here the final sound is n. And here the final sound is k, p, sh. Alright, so that's the second step. Listen to the final sound of the infinitive, and then the pronunciation of the regular past tense depends on the final sound of the infinitive. So this will become automatic when you're learning more and when you've learned the basics, but first maybe it's a good idea to think about it. What is the final sound of the infinitive? And then we can look at the rules about the pronunciation. For example, here is rule number 1. If the regular verb ends in the sound t or d, then the ending is id. That's id. For example, start becomes started. Invite becomes invited. Hate, hated. So that's started, invited, hated. Now, why do people make mistakes with the pronunciation? Because they think that the other examples are the same. Livid, smiled, turned. But no, this is different. There is a different rule for these verbs. So this one, started, invited, hated. But here we have lived, smiled, turned. Now why is it different? Well, here is the rule. If the regular verb ends in a voiced sound, then the ending is pronounced d. Now what does that mean? We have to understand this word voiced. Voiced. So there is actually one rule for voiced sounds, and there is another rule for unvoiced sounds. So we have to understand what is meant by voiced and what do we mean by unvoiced. Well, you have to look at the end of the word. Here, for example, live, the end of the word is voiced because you use your voice when you pronounce the sound. In this case, live, the voice sound is v. Here, smile, the voiced sound is l. Here, the voiced sound is n. The verb is turn and the voiced sound is n. So these sounds are voiced. V, l, n. Now in the next list, the end of the word is unvoiced because you don't use your voice. For example, work, the sound is k. Stop, the sound is p. And wash, the sound is sh. So you can hear no voice. K, p, sh. And that's different from v, l, n. So let's go back to this second rule here. If the regular verb ends in a voice sound, then the ending is pronounced d. In other words, the ending is voiced because d is voiced. Now the next rule has a different sound, t, at the end of the past tense because the sound is unvoiced. So here it's d, voiced, and here is t, unvoiced. So let's look at the examples for this second rule. Live becomes lived. Smile becomes smiled. Turn becomes turned. And then rule number 3, if the regular verb ends in an unvoiced sound, then the ending is t. For example, work, worked. Stop, stopped. Wash, washed. So there you have the 3 rules. 1, 2, 3. So let's look at more examples with these 3 rules in the next parts of the lesson. So here are the 3 steps again. look at the infinitive of the verb, listen to the final sound of the infinitive, and the pronunciation of the regular past tense depends on the final sound of the infinitive. So here's the first rule again. If the regular verb's in the sound t or d, then the ending is id. For example, started, invited, hated, wanted, dated, seated, decided, needed, headed, waited, visited. Now the pronunciation of these verbs is quite easy to remember because there's no other way to pronounce these words. You have to say tud and dud at the end of these words. So let's look at the second rule, and it's with this rule that students sometimes make mistakes or sometimes get into bad habits. For example, if the regular verb ends in a voiced sound, then the ending is pronounced d. Live becomes lived, not lived, lived. Smile becomes smiled, not smiled, smiled. For all of these verbs, you don't pronounce the ed at the end. Turned, loved, smiled, enjoyed, delayed, played, tried, studied, chilled, realized, arrived, closed, phoned, allowed. So let's look at the next list. Now this is a different rule. This is the third rule about the pronunciation. If the regular verb ends in an unvoiced sound, then the ending is pronounced t. For example, work becomes worked. Now, some students make a mistake and say worked, but there's no ed because you don't pronounce the E. It's worked. And again, let's go through these. Kicked, packed, liked, picked, looked, picked again. Cooked, stopped, stepped, shopped, jumped, dropped. So you can see all of these words have unvoiced sounds at the end of the infinitive. Let's look at these ones. Hoped, hopped, coped, passed, kissed, danced, washed, wished. So you have to get used to this sound at the end with the t sound. Watched, matched, ditched, crunched, laughed. So all of these have an unvoiced sound at the end of the infinitive, and you pronounce t for the ending. So this brings us to the end of step 1 in this series about the past simple. So we'll move on to step 2, in which we look at the irregular verbs and the form of the different structures in the past simple tense.